Tonight in Texas, in the trial of one of the men charged with dragging to death a black man simply because of his race. The testimony today was devastating. The suspect's racial hatred was so deep and threatening and well known to his friends. We continue our in-depth reporting now with NBC's Jim Cummins on the portrait of a bigot.
Today, even more evidence against dragging death suspect Bill King. First, William Hoover, who served time in prison with King, testified that King discussed abducting a black man and killing him to win membership in a racist gang. King and two other white men are accused of kidnapping James Byrd Jr. and dragging him 3 miles to his death behind their pickup truck last June. Today, an FBI expert testified that tires on that truck matched tire track impressions near Byrd's dismembered body. Finally, a friend of King's, Tommy Falk, testified that on the night of the murder, King and one of the other suspects, Lawrence Brewer, left a party angry when a black woman showed up. Falk says 2 days later, police recovered the chain suspected in the murder behind his place after King and Brewer visited him.
Well, the chain is probably a little larger and a little rougher than you would just think when you say it's a chain, and when you look at it and visualize that being tied around ankles, I think it has an impact.
There was even more testimony about that pickup truck. FBI agents said they searched it high and low, found flesh and blood samples on the bottom of the truck and on the tailpipe, presumably from Byrd's body. Members of his family say they are repulsed by the testimony, but glad justice is being served. Mary Verrett is his sister.
Things are going very well. Well, please.
Prosecutors have presented evidence that Bill King was an angry young man with white supremacist views who was in that pickup truck the night that James Byrd Jr. was dragged to his death. Defense lawyers have not said whether they will call King to testify in his own behalf. Jim Cummins, NBC News, Jasper, Texas.
James Byrd Jr. was a 49-year-old African-American male who was killed and brutally dismembered by a local gang of white supremacists in the small Texas town of Jasper on June 7, 1998. The gruesome murder shocked the nation and led to the creation of new hate crime laws, the discussion of prevalence of white supremacist gangs in U.S. prisons, and marked the first time that 2 white men were executed for the death of a black man in modern Texas history. This is the story of the death of James Byrd Jr. James Byrd Jr. was born on May 2, 1949 in Beaumont, Texas, and raised in the small town of Jasper. His parents were James Byrd Sr. and Stella Byrd. James Jr. was one of 8 children the Byrds had. James's life revolved around the church, and he was strongly committed to it. His mother was a Sunday school teacher, and his father was a deacon. He also sung music for the church choir and played the piano. He graduated from high school in 1967. This is significant since this was the last time the high schools in Jasper were segregated. Despite being intellectually inclined, he declined to go to college and did not follow in the footsteps of his siblings. He eventually found a job as a vacuum cleaner salesman and would eventually have 3 children. He struggled with drinking problems and enrolled in an Alcoholics Anonymous course. Byrd was known to be polite and a nice person who had an affinity for music. He was known to walk around the town of Jasper as he did not own a car. In the early morning hours of June 7, 1998, Byrd had been hitchhiking on Martin Luther King Drive when a 1982 Ford pickup that was gray stopped in front of him. 3 white men, John William King, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and Sean Allen Berry, had agreed to give Byrd a ride. Instead of following Byrd's directions, the trio then took him to a logging road and savagely beat him. They urinated and defecated on him, and the men then proceeded to tie his ankles to the bumper of their truck. The 3 then dragged Byrd's body 9 miles down a rough road, causing it to be dismembered. Dr. Tommy Brown, a forensic pathologist, described Byrd's body. "I received the head, neck, torso, and an arm separately of Byrd. The autopsy revealed extensive injuries all over Byrd's body. Nearly all of Byrd's arterial ribs were fractured. He suffered massive brush burn abrasions all over his body. Both testicles were missing, and gravel was found in his scrotal sac. Both knees and part of his foot were ground down. His left cheek was ground down to the jawbone, and his buttocks was ground down to his sacrum and lower spine. Some of his toes were missing, and others were fractured. Large lacerations on the legs exposed muscle. His brain and head were left intact and suffered no lacerations. The attack included the use of an industrial metal chain that was tied around James's ankles. Somewhere along the way, James's body hit the edge of a culvert, decapitating it. The remains of Byrd's body were then dumped at a cemetery of an African American church, and the three men then went to a cookout. Byrd's body was found the next day, and it was quickly deduced that this was a hate crime. Byrd was 49 years old when he died. The Federal Bureau of Investigations, or FBI, was called in to lead and assist the Jasper authorities, and they arrived within 24 hours after Byrd's death. The lead investigator noted the extreme circumstances of the case. Various items like a wrench with the name Barry written on it were found, and a lighter with the word possum was also found. In total, 81 pieces of James Byrd were recovered. The three men who were responsible for Byrd's murder were Sean Allen Barry, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and John William King. Barry would state that King and Brewer were the main acts in the attack. Both Lawrence Brewer and John King were well-known white supremacists who had spent time in jail together. King had beaten Byrd with a baseball bat and then dragged him behind the truck. King stated the motive for the killing was for being raped by a group of black inmates. Some even think that the guards at the jail had conspired with a white supremacist gang to get King gang raped. He then left the prison full of hatred for blacks and met fellow white supremacists Brewer and Barry. They dragged Byrd nearly 3 miles, and he was still alive up until his body hit the edge of a drainage culvert, which decapitated Byrd's head. King, Brewer, and Barry were charged and quickly apprehended with Byrd's death. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. They would be the first white men to be put to death for the murder of a black man in modern Texas history. During the trial, King had no remorse and even smiled at times during the proceedings. One of Byrd's relatives noted King's nonchalant nature and callous disregard for Byrd's life as an act of defiance. The prosecutor also showed King's numerous tattoos that paid homage to the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party. The murder of James Byrd Jr. shocked the nation and the world. The brutality of the murder stunned many in 1990s America, as many had thought such hatreds were a thing of the country's past. The release of the crime movie American History X also further brought attention to racism in America. The attack on Byrd was reminiscent of classic lynchings of African Americans, in which the perpetrators would celebrate with a cookout after the murder. James's murder also happened the same year as the death of Matthew Shepard, who was murdered because he was gay. Then U.S. President Bill Clinton met with the Byrd's relatives and vowed to pass hate crime legislation, and in 2009, President Barack Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes and Prevention Act, the nation's first expansive hate crime laws. Brewer was scheduled for execution by lethal injection on September 21, 2011. It was reported that he had no remorse and was fully content with his crime. As far as any regrets, no. I have no regrets. No, I'd do it all over again, to tell you the truth. Brewer requested a last meal which was fairly large and included, but not limited to, 2 chicken fried steaks, onions, a triple patty cheeseburger, 3 fully loaded fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, and 1 pint of Bluebell vanilla ice cream. Brewer then declined the meal and the food was discarded. This prompted Texas to suspend the last meal ritual and has never been reinstated. Brewer was executed on September 21st at 2011. King was executed on April 24th, 2019. King had beaten and dragged Byrd with his truck until he died. Barry's role in the crime was less so than King and Brewer, and therefore he was spared the death penalty. Barry had slit Byrd's neck before he was tied to the truck. Barry was given a life sentence, with the earliest parole hearing set for 2038. He lives 23 hours a day in a 8 by 6 foot cell and is allowed only 1 hour a day for exercise. Barry was dating his girlfriend named Christina Martel by proxy, and they have one child together. The gruesome murder of James Byrd Jr. still haunts the Texas town of Jasper, mainly along racial lines, as some white residents want to put the murder behind them. Byrd is buried in Jasper, Texas.